Hi, this is Delegate Steve Aarons, District 36, representing Kent, Queen Anne, Cecil, and Caroline counties, and you're listening to the Maryland Association of Counties podcast.
Welcome to The Briefing Room, here on the Conduit Street podcast. I'm Don Butchko. This is episode 2 of our 5-part conversation on energy. Today, we're talking about energy regions. What are they, why they matter, and how they shape the broader conversation. If you have listened to the debate around energy, you probably think of the PJM Interconnection, or PJM for short, as a villain. Slow to approve projects and heartlessly letting them wither in the queue. But the story is not really that simple, and the role of PJM is critical to keeping our regional grid functioning. To help break down what the PJM is and their place in the broader conversation, we're joined today by Jason Stanek, Executive Director of Governmental Services at PJM Interconnection. Jason, welcome to the briefing room.
Dom, thank you for having me.
To start our conversation, first, what is the PJM Interconnection?
Until recently, not many people in the state were familiar with PJM, but PJM has been around for nearly 100 years. We're actually going to celebrate a 100-year anniversary next year. What PJM is one of 7 independent power grids in the United States, and PJM, frankly, is the largest. What we do is that we're effectively responsible for the transmission of electricity across a very large geographic footprint that spans 13 states plus the District of Columbia. We ensure that this wholesale power grid remains reliable to serve the needs of those customers. And we do so by ensuring that the grid is properly planned, that the markets properly reflect the signals of supply and demand, and we ensure that those electrons travel safely from the points of generation to the points where they're ultimately consumed.
Talk a little more about that history, because it's really interesting. PJM, what do those 3 letters stand for? Where did you start, and how did you expand to the size you are today?
So PJM has its roots in Philadelphia with the Philadelphia Electric Company. And there was some thought back then, nearly 100 years ago, that there would be some economies of scale if the utilities would actually pool their resources to coordinated planning and coordinated dispatch of electricity. And over the years and decades, the states that were participating in PJM evolved from Pennsylvania to New Jersey to Maryland, hence PJM. But we didn't stop there. After the 1950s, the footprint of the power grid continued both south and west. So we serve as far west as Chicago, as far south as North Carolina. Some of our states are fully within the grid, and some of the states only have parts of their states within the grid. But in total, it's about 88,000 miles of transmission line that we operate. And as noted, we serve about 67 million customers, including all 6 million in the state of Maryland.
If you look at the PJM map, it's wild. Like you said, you only serve portions of states. Maryland, you serve all of Maryland, all of DC. Chicago, for example. Chicago is literally an island in the Midwest that PJM's a part of. Talk a little bit, because you were on in the fall, and so we had this conversation, a similar conversation in the fall. But talk a little bit about your map and how that's evolved, because if you look at it, it's interesting, to say the least. It looks like gerrymandering.
It does, because as you noted, we have some non-contiguous regions, including the entire city of Chicago, but not much of the rest of the state, which is within the jurisdiction of a fellow grid operator called the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, one of the 7 in the country there. So over time, different transmission owners who have turned over operational control of their high voltage transmission lines to PJM have made a conscious decision whether or not to participate in one power grid region over another. All the regions operate somewhat differently. There's a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences. One commonality is that we are all regulated by the federal government through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and we are collectively known as RTOs, which is the term for Regional Transmission Organization. You'll see sometimes you'll have a transmission owner move from one RTO to another, but that's not terribly common. Although when it does happen, as you said, the map gets slice and dice, so it looks a little bit like congressional gerrymandering.
Talk a little bit now about your relationship, the PJM's relationship with the states. So you cover, I think you said 13 states plus the District of Columbia. What is that dynamic like? Who has what authority, et cetera?
At the wholesale level, we have wholesale jurisdiction regulation in the United States as well as retail jurisdiction. So entities like the Maryland Public Service Commission are the retail regulators, but the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington, D.C. is the wholesale regulator. Our regulator is this entity known as FERC, whereas the utilities in Maryland, such as Pepco and Baltimore Gas Electric, their regulator is the Maryland PSC. Now, even though the states don't regulate PJM, they're obviously a very important stakeholder in our process. And there are 5 entities in the state that we have rather frequent communications with. Starting with the Public Service Commission, but also the State Energy Office, which is the Maryland Energy Administration, the State Ratepayer Advocate, which is the Office of People's Counsel. And of course, we spend a lot of time, particularly during the legislative session, with both lawmakers in the General Assembly as well as the governor's office.
What then is your relationship like with the local governments, if any? You have the state in Maryland, you have these 5 entities, you work closely, but the state doesn't regulate you. How often, because this is a local government podcast, how often do you guys interact with counties, municipalities, if at all?
More often than you think. And this has increased dramatically within the past 2 years, particularly as issues such as data centers and the race for AI supremacy have become kitchen table issues. So I've testified before county commissions and have made presentations everywhere from Calvert County up to Carroll, Prince George's County, which is a potential hotbed of activity for data center development, has shown a lot of interest. So we're hearing from county councils, individual county commissioners, and we answer the call when they seek information about who PJM is, what our role is. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions sometimes. Is PJM the entity that is building transmission lines in the state? No, we are not a transmission developer. We're not a generation developer. And we neither own transmission assets or generation assets. At the end of the day, we are a nonprofit organization whose primary responsibility is to ensure grid reliability 24/7. And we've done a relatively good job of that over our 99 plus year history.
There have been a number of projects that have impacted Maryland that have become a little controversial. Folks are really familiar with the Public Service Commission process for public input for some of these projects, but they might not be as familiar with the PJM process. Can you talk a little bit about, I'm a county elected official, something's going on, and I want to give our commission's input. How do they go about doing that? What does that look like?
So that is one of the 3 functions that I mentioned earlier, where PJM is the transmission planner. So we plan for the grid both today, tomorrow, and upwards of 20 years into the future, detecting where we may see problems on the grid down the road. When we see problems or reliability violations, we effectively issue an RFP for transmission developers to propose projects to resolve the problem, effectively to propose solutions. And we've seen that a number of times. Transmission owners such as BGE or other entities that may not actually be a household name in the state of Maryland can tender proposals to resolve the issue. At that point, PJM will review the proposals tendered, and we will select the one that we feel will best address the needs for the grid. Where the Public Service Commission comes in is they are the state siting authority. So they will review the project, determine if it's actually needed, work with other state agencies to ensure that environmental conditions are met. And they ultimately make the determination whether or not to grant something called a certificate of public convenience and necessity, which allows that transmission developer to go forth and build that project. We do recognize that in Maryland, which is a relatively small and densely populated state, that building any type of energy infrastructure is oftentimes difficult and controversial, whether it be solar panels, whether it be offshore wind off of Ocean City, or whether it be large transmission lines and towers that may need to be developed in areas where they previously were not.
Talk more about this, notorious queue. I kind of teed up at the beginning, and if folks have been following, especially not really this past session, not the 26 session, but the 25 session, the PJM and their evil queue. And what is this, England? They're making us wait in line. This is America. We don't wait in line. Talk a little bit about that and kind of what improvements you've made, because I know that you have been focused really hard in our conversations trying to fix it.
Yeah, the interconnection queue has been the source of a lot of misinformation and a misunderstanding. And it's relatively complicated, but I'll try to break it down right now. The queue is effectively a line of applicants who have projects that they would like to propose. And these are generating projects. So they could be power plants, natural gas plant, solar array, battery, you name it. What they do is they need to apply to PJM to ensure that they could safely connect to the grid. Obviously, the grid is a very, very large machine. I mentioned 88,000 miles of connected wire across the region. Depending on where they wish to connect, that section of the grid may be congested, or it may have available capacity where they could plug in relatively easy without having to pay for any network upgrades or other transmission infrastructure. For the longest time, the applicants that were connecting in for much of PJM's history were coal plants and natural gas plants who were very familiar with the process. But there came a point, effectively overlapping with COVID, where we saw a large number of much smaller projects begin to enter the queue. So these were renewable projects, think solar and wind. Unfortunately, many of these projects were effectively being applied for by entities that never had any real intent of building the project. They may have planned to flip the project to somebody else, but having that queue position carried some value, and it was able to be transferred. Once we saw the number of projects increase rather exponentially, they were doubling from year to year. We worked with our stakeholders to file a near unanimous proposal with FERC to reform the queue. FERC approved those reforms, and then we were off to the races. Those reforms were implemented in 2023. And to date, we've been able to process and move out most of those projects that were waiting in the queue. We're at a situation now where in Maryland is we only have 10 remaining projects to be reviewed. Everything else has been processed. 21 projects in Maryland have all of the necessary PJM approvals. But the problem is most of these projects are not getting built. So now we have to ask ourselves the question, why aren't they getting built? And there's a number of reasons. Permitting and siting delays are one. Not having the actual equipment due to supply chain issues is another. And of course, the economic conditions, both nationally and within the state, have begun to deteriorate. Interest rates are relatively high. Projects that may have penciled out a few years ago may not be in as good a shape as they are now. So there's a number of reasons why projects actually don't go forward. That said, we're using a number of tools available at our disposal right now to process new applications even faster in a 1 to 2 year turnaround time. We're also using AI with the assistance of Google to help process some of the queue applications. So I have no doubt PJM will be an industry leader in very short order in terms of processing applications. The problem is once they're processed, we need to actually build them in the state, whether it's a new natural gas plant, whether it's a large solar array. So we'll need to work with our state and local officials, particularly the local officials, right? They're the closest to their constituents. They're the closest to the property owners who may have concerns or interests in the development of this needed infrastructure that may be going in their backyard.
I want to take a couple steps back because there was one thing that you brought up in particular that I think is really interesting. That's a part of the story that I haven't heard a lot about. Back in the early 2020s, COVID era, people are signing up for the queue, but then they're going to flip the project to someone else. They're actually not going to build it. That seems like a whole segment of the conversation that folks really aren't talking about. Can you describe that a little bit more? It sounds like, what is it, Wall Street investors coming in, or what's the situation like?
No, a lot of them were speculators who were effectively queue squatting, right? They would file the application.
I like that, queue squatting.
Queue squatting. And they would hold that queue position as the projects were being processed and moving forward. And we determined that only about 10 to 15% of those applications would ultimately result in a project that connects to the grid, which means that, right, 85 to 90% of those projects that were filed and that PJM spent a lot of time and energy reviewing never actually materialized. So what some of the reforms that were implemented and approved by FERC required that applicants now actually pay a security deposit and a fee when they filed their application. We also required that the entity, the developer, provide evidence of site control, that they actually owned the land and they had the approvals to move forward with this project before PJM would even review it. And then we moved to instead of going from a first in, first out approach, we moved from a first in, first ready approach. Whereas in the old process, if we had a problematic applicant at the head of the line, that could slow things down for everybody behind that applicant. Whereas now we could have applicants and developers leapfrog ahead of slower moving applications, if that makes sense. That will expedite everybody, get them through the queue. The security deposits will ensure that legitimate entities have skin in the game, whereas previously they didn't. And we're already seeing the quality of these applications improve with the FERC reforms taking full effect.
Talk a little bit now too about the numbers. So you said in the state of Maryland, you have 10 projects left to review, and then the queue's cleaned up, and you instituted these reforms. So I'm assuming you'll see the number, like the total volume of applications potentially go down, but you would also think then you would have, higher quality applications coming in, and these are the ones ready to move forward. What are you guys looking at, looking ahead the next few years? Are you seeing enough generation come in, or are there still issues there? And I know there's a lot of strings we can pull because there's supply chain and there's regulation, and we'll get into that. But in terms of raw numbers, what are you guys projecting?
Yeah, let's talk about raw numbers because you're right. Later on this year, the entire backlog of queue projects, not only in Maryland, but across all 13 states, will be reduced to zero. That said, we still expect 50 to 60 gigawatt shortfall of resources within the next decade. So what's a gigawatt, right? A gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. When you think of a large natural gas cycle plant, it's approximately pushing about 1,000 megawatts. We are 50 to 60 gigawatts short of power across the PJM region. Why is that? We're forecasting significant increases in demand for electricity. We mentioned the AI arms race. PJM is the largest market in the globe for data center development. 90% of all internet traffic globally transmits through Northern Virginia, particularly Loudoun County. So these are issues that we're looking at right now. I testified earlier this year before the House Environment and Natural Resources Committee that Maryland is in a particularly challenged state. We haven't been investing in our energy infrastructure at the scale and pace that we've needed to. PJM has determined that there are reliability violations on the grid that serves the state in particular. And without major transmission projects going into service in the near term, we're actually expecting potential service disruptions as early as next summer, July of 2027. So I am heartened by the fact that we have the attention of policymakers in the state. We just need to move quickly to ensure that energy infrastructure is developed.
There were a lot of scary words in the last 30 seconds when you're talking about reliability violations as well as service disruptions. I have to ask you, can you dig into that a little bit more? First, with the reliability violations, what does that look like? And then I think we all know what service disruptions is, but what is that?
Service disruptions may be a short or longer period where electricity supply is not available to the end user. Don't like to use the words blackouts or brownouts because those have some emotional attachment associated with them. But if a customer is not receiving their electricity supply, they view that as some type of a major disruption. And we actually had a disruption to the system in the Baltimore gas service territory just last summer, August 11th of 2025. And that was the first forced outage on PJM system in several years. So it was a rather remarkable event. It didn't receive its tremendous amount of media coverage, but that was due in part to the efforts of both the local utility, BGE, and PJM taking actions to minimize the effect and scale of that outage, where ultimately it was just more than about 20 minutes. And I would say only 3,000 customers. Obviously, I don't want to minimize the impact to those customers, but about 3,000 customers were out for that period until the utility, Baltimore Gas, was able to get the power restored.
I'm a policymaker. I'm listening to this because we have some pretty cool folks who are very intent on this podcast, and I'm hearing, oh my God, next summer we're gonna have blackouts, brownouts, service disruptions. My constituents are gonna hate that. I'm gonna hate that. What can be done? Can anything be done in the next year to kind of firm up our grid?
Capital investments in the infrastructure are needed, and they need to be made relatively quickly. However, that puts us on a collision track with affordability, which is a buzzword that has really taken center stage, right?
The biggest word. This was supposed to be the session of affordability.
So when you have affordability issues center stage, but you also recognize you need to invest in energy infrastructure, which is very expensive, especially if you need to do it quickly, there's a problem there. And legislators and policymakers have to figure out, how do we best ensure grid reliability while maintaining reasonable utility rates, which is the jurisdiction of the state utility regulator. It becomes very difficult. PJM at the end of the day it's mostly a bunch of engineers and technicians that are able to determine where those violations are, where the weak spots of the transmission system are. And they could bring out a ruler and draw a new transmission line on a paper map and said, this solves the problem, right? This relieves the constraint. Part of the reason we had that disruption in Baltimore last year was because the transmission system in and around the city of Baltimore is very old and very constrained. We need new transmission lines in and around Baltimore, and several have been proposed. One's under construction now, the Tri-County line that BGE is developing. There's another project called the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project, MPRP, which is being developed by a different transmission owner known as PSEG, PSEG. And we believe that with these projects placed in service, we could avoid sort of our worst fears of having service disruptions in 2027.
Let's shift focus now on the really the state and local level. In the state of Maryland, local governments are pretty preempted when it comes to energy siting. It was like you read the Mako talking points before, so I appreciate the sentiment there. But a lot of this is still on the Public Service Commission. There is still a local role. But what both the state and local government coordinating, what can we do better to move projects along faster? And how does Maryland rank compared to the other 13 states in the PJM? Are we average? Are we absolutely terrible at putting up energy? Where are we on the map?
Well, let me begin by saying that the voices of county officials, local officials are important. As one who previously served on the Maryland Public Service Commission, there is a statutory requirement that the commissioners give, quote unquote, due consideration to the positions of local officials. And we try to do that every day. I think there needs to be a better understanding of where we get our energy from, how it's delivered, and what that impact on cost is. Because at the end of the day, electricity is a commodity, like a precious metal, like frozen concentrated orange juice, like pork bellies. And if there's an increase in demand and not an corresponding increase in supply, that balance is out of whack. And prices will reflect that. Because we are in a market, the state of Maryland is known as a restructured state. Some call it a deregulated state. We know that our utilities in Maryland are prohibited by law from owning or building generation. So we rely on competitive forces to incentivize that generation to come to the state. In terms of how do we get projects built faster, I know that there have been several laws passed in this most recent session with the help of Senator Feldman and others, and in previous sessions, to expedite permitting and siting. We need to do more of that. We need to do more of that more quickly. Instead of years, perhaps we could reduce that to a period of months. Maryland is similar to many other states in terms of how quickly we could build the projects. It's not winning any gold stars, but states can learn from each other, right? How to pass either laws or regulations, get them on the books while providing due process, while providing feedback from property owners and local communities. Obviously, you don't want to move forward with the project without proper local engagement. And we've seen projects in the past that fail to do that, and the end result is usually not pretty for them. So being open, communicating the need, why we need to build the project. At the end of the day, will it change hearts and minds? Maybe, or maybe not. If you don't want a transmission tower outside of your kitchen window, I fully understand that. But we live in a society where everybody's on their mobile devices. Everybody's now using ChatGPT for a lot of different daily functions. And of course, there's national security reasons why this country is trying to work on a global scale to advance beyond some others that are also trying to build out their AI capabilities.
Looking ahead now, because we've covered a lot of ground, and we did kind of talk about the short-term future, but looking ahead, what are your thoughts on what the future of the grid will look like? Where will those pain points be? What will comprise it? Are we going to have batteries everywhere? Are we going to have mini nukes?
The grid of yesterday is not going to look anything like the grid of tomorrow. You mentioned batteries. A large number of the projects in our future queue are battery energy storage devices, and we're going to see more of that. Other states outside of PJM have advanced on batteries in California and in Texas. We've been a little slower to adopt batteries, but I think that's where the future is going to be, because that will enable the clean resources such as solar and wind to store their power and then discharge them when it's needed. There's also that nuclear renaissance where states that may have been opposed to nuclear are now either embracing it or giving it a second look. There's been a lot of discussions of whether to add another reactor to Calvert Cliffs. And realistically, it'll take a good 10, 15, 20 years to develop a new reactor if we started today to do so. So that is not going to resolve the issues to avoid service disruptions next summer. Effectively, we need to throw everything but the kitchen sink at this problem. And it's going to take customers, it's going to take local utilities, it'll take politicians, and it'll take the grid operator working together on some of these big solutions to make sure that the lights stay on.
Well, Jason, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you for joining us on the briefing room.
Thanks, Tom. Always good to be with you.
Let me read us out. Remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. The Conduit Street podcast, The Briefing Room, will be out on Tuesdays with our normal show on Fridays. Remember now to register for our annual Mako Summer Conference, August 12th through the 15th in Ocean City, Maryland. And thank you to everyone for listening to The Briefing Room here on the Conduit Street podcast.